Okay, everyone, welcome to another ARCS chat. My name is Robin Bauer-Kilgo. I am the Association Manager for ARCS. I have a couple of quick announcements and I'm going to throw it over to the rest of the ARCS chat team. Just so everyone knows, this is streaming live on YouTube. So between Zoom and YouTube, there is a little bit of a delay. So just be aware of that. If you'd like to participate in the chat, which we are more than happy to have you do, you will need to sign in with your Google or YouTube account. It's just part of the system. So feel free to do that if you want to participate. It's always good to everyone say hello, where they're from. You can tell us how many COVID shots you've gotten so far this year. That seems to be a huge topic of discussion lately. So feel free to put that in there as well. And a couple quick programming notes. If you missed our all members meeting that happened a couple weeks ago, it's actually over on the ARCS website, arcsinfo.org. There you can kind of see what all the committees have been working on, what are some plans for the future. You can see some of our sponsors and other people saying hello. So feel free to go take a look at that recording. We're going to have a bunch of meetups happening pretty soon, all via, of course, this fabulous virtual landscape we all have now. But if you have certain areas that you're specializing in, like contract registrars or anything else, I would urge you to go check out our website. They're going to be scheduled within the next month or so. It's going to be on a bunch of different areas because the meetups team has really decided to kind of get going with the meetups programming, which we're excited about because we can say hello to people. So keep an eye on that. And then finally, ARCS is planning a series of workshops starting on May 6th, going through June 17th. It's a series of 3 workshops or webinars all about leadership. So if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to go take a look at the website again. We just did a save the date for it, May 6th through June 17th through our weekly news or bi-weekly newsletter rather. But more excitingly, it'll be open for registration probably within the next week or so. So keep an eye on that. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand the mic over to John Robinette, one of our hosts.
Hey, welcome back for another ARCS chat. With us, as always, is Amanda Robinson.
Hey guys, Amanda here, coming to you from sunny Florida at the Museum of Fine Arts in St. Petersburg.
And we also have our special guest, Paddy Johnson. Paddy is an online pioneer who has more than 15 years experience writing about art, editing artist writing, and writing grants. She is the founder of VVrkshop, an online platform designed to help artists and art world professionals online and off. Prior to this, she founded the blog Art F City and has written for publications like CNN, the New York Times, and New York Magazine. She's made a career out of working with institutions and individuals by helping them produce their best work. So yes, what we're going to be doing today is walking through several of the key news items in order to sort of deconstruct what's actually behind them and get a little bit more perspective on what's happening and how they might play out. And before we do that, I do want to wish everybody, safety and health. We're still, going through a difficult time, and it's been really a year that we've been going through this. And, in April of last year, we started having sort of real, dedicated, industry talk about, how COVID and coronavirus is affecting our field. And so, just kind of marking time, now that we're a year on. So with that, we're still dealing with how the industry is affected by it. And so one of the key components that has come out of it is deaccessioning. And that's really, as collections care people and as people just interested in museums and art and artifacts, we are all sort of wrestling with this problem. So, and it just keeps coming up. So, we want to discuss deaccessioning, and with deaccessioning, it's really a discussion about museum funding, or at least it's turned into that discussion. And I want to ask Paddy, what's your take on what's happening here, and how do you expect the topic to develop?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone here for having me on this panel and for this talk. It's really exciting to be here. And before I get started, I just wanted to let you all know what my vaccine situation is, since that seems to be the requirement, which is I am about to get mine. I'm scheduled for next week, but I did go in yesterday for one. Was not able to get it due to a computer glitch. So now that we're all squared away here, I feel like we can really dive into this subject of deaccessioning. Now,
Deaccession the virus.
Yeah. An urgent matter for sure.
Yes.
No, I think like, to my mind, I think a lot of these problems related to deaccessioning, if we take maybe a wider angle lens to this, is rather than sort of getting into the minutia of how much money and each acquisition is going to bring in and who has it and who doesn't, which I think actually we should get into at some point. But the broader lens here is, what do people need? And if we can ask that about the public, if we can ask that about the museum staff, and we can ask that about as broad a swath of people as possible and start getting answers to that, then I think we can sort of handle the question not just of deaccessioning, but also a lot of the kind of social issues that tend to dovetail with a lot of these conversations, right? So we've had a lot of conversations about the value of labor and how we value the labor of arts workers, how we value the labor of the, say, just custodial staff and security guards at museums, how we value, I think that's probably like the list there that I have off the top of my head, but like that, those types of labor, I think traditionally are just really underfunded in the art and that in the art world, and that is systemic. And so if we start from the question of, well, we have this systemic inequity, what are the things that we can do to try and address that? And I think the first thing is, how can we pay for labor? Then we can start to address, like, well, what can we do to achieve that? So that would be my sort of overall starting point for the conversation.
Right. And that's a super important point. And I know, Amanda, you had something to add because, obviously we're having this discussion largely as a result of the AAMD resolution that came out last year around this time that loosened their own institutional restrictions on the topic. But you have some thoughts. It's not really that simple, is it?
Yeah, well, as no one else was privy to this, but I kind of went off a little bit with my frustration earlier and how deaccessioning's been portrayed in the media, particularly over the past year since AMD has come out with their resolution. And the truth of the matter is that if you look into the revised guidelines from the resolution, they're not really very broad, and they're still pretty restrictive. And unless you are out there deaccessioning items that are earning you millions of dollars, the revenue that you can use to go towards your operating costs is very limited. So arguably only the institutions, and I don't mean to offend anyone, this is just my perspective, arguably the institutions that will benefit from that are the ones that have multi-million-dollar valuable objects in their collection. Oftentimes that's mostly limited to an art collection. And if they can spare, a piece worth that much money as part of their deaccessioning process, do they really need the financial help that bad? We're looking at very few places in the United States that would benefit from that. And it doesn't really help out the everyman. And, when you come to deaccessioning, it's not like you're going in the storage unit and you're like, okay, well, that can go, that can go, that can go. You deaccession things in a very specific way, and that hasn't changed. The resolution didn't change that. So anything you might be selling from your collection is likely something that's not museum quality, it's damaged, it doesn't speak to your collecting plan or to the mission of your museum. So it's like a very narrow focused amount of what you could possibly dispose of ethically and then, sell or deaccession ethically and dispose of. And disposing is, of course, one option is to sell it at auction. And then what would the revenue be that you'd earn from that? And then who could possibly, use the interest off of those earnings to pay for your utility bill to run an entire building? So those are the things that I find that aren't really portrayed very accurately. It's quite frustrating, and it's not a dig at our field per se. It's just a dig at the way it's portrayed, and I don't think it's quite fair. It's quite polarizing.
Well, I mean, I think this does get to some of the issues that happen with, that just happen with media coverage in general. There are blind spots for sure. And there's also the issue that media coverage is not really any different than any other part of the larger economy, in the sense that we have things that get more attention and things that don't get a lot of attention. And the things that get a lot of attention tend to have a lot of money attached to them, and the things that don't, and are in need of more care, obviously those are the things that don't get a lot of attention. Now, structurally, the media is sort of, and I use that term in a way right now that I don't actually like, because I think the media is not like one giant monolith. We're all people, right? And that, I think, if there's, we're like 10 minutes in and I'm like, I've got a theme and it's people. But if we if we're to talk about the things that make stories and things that people want to read, nobody cares about a painting that has a few chips out of it that is going to be deaccessioned. It's boring news. Now, I didn't make it that way. That's just the way it is. But the things that are going to get media attention are the giant Warhol that the Baltimore Museum wants to sell off, because that is it's big, it's glistening, it has all these weighty elements, but it does have a cost, right? And that cost is larger than the cost of the painting. That cost comes at the price of all the coverage that can't be that can't be produced because this one thing gets consumed.
Right. And, and the question I have is say a situation like Baltimore, who has for a long time been selling parts of its collection in order to do quote unquote progressive deaccessioning, in order to fund the purchase of artists that better represent the diversity of the city. Would their situation that they faced last fall have even arisen if it weren't for the virus and the shutdowns and the financial losses, and then as a result the resolution, which opened this door, and many people believe that it's not really going to go back to the way it was. I mean, obviously people have been deaccessioning forever. It's a part of healthy collecting. So were they just trying to take advantage of the moment to do more, or would people have even cared if it were a non-pandemic year?
I mean, this is my own personal opinion based on, not a hell of a lot in terms of I didn't speak to all the people involved, but knowing Katie Siegel, who has been invested in this, and who I have, shared panels with and all the rest, I cannot imagine that this was something that was just a tossed off idea to make money. It's just not how she operates.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where I think some of these things get lost in the coverage. If you look at the people involved, that often tells you what's going on.
Right.
And I personally, this is a somewhat contentious position, I recognize, but I'm all in favor for that Warhol going somewhere else. The Warhols are at every single museum, and it's frankly oppressive. I find I'm whenever I go to Europe, I'm oh, I don't have to look at a Warhol.
Yeah. Yeah.
Everywhere here.
Yeah.
So like the idea that we could reimagine a museum without a ginormous painting. I mean, I get that one is very, very significant, but like the idea that we could reimagine what a like museum might look like minus a Warhol, to me, that's just like, it's brave and exciting.
Right.
I would not say that about other museums, but that one for sure.
I have 2 points I want to touch back on based on what you both had said. And the first is, this resolution that AAMD came out with is specifically related to now allowing institutions to use funds for direct care. Previously, if you were an art institution and you deaccessioned something and disposed of it, you could only use that money to buy something new for your collection. And I find it really hypocritical because a lot of institutions have been employing direct care for quite some time in their collection practices. And art-based museums who do use funds from their deaccessions to maybe pay staff who specifically deal with cleaning out their collection, or maybe they use it to purchase frames when they acquire something new. Like, it's not so tightly held. And so now to come out and say, oh, we're going to lighten the strings a little and we're not going to punish anyone for 2 years. It's like, who have you been punishing since before then? I find that quite hypocritical. And that's not to say that like the approach that Baltimore took, just like you said, Paddy, I have no idea what the conversations were at that institution, the practices they went through. As an accredited organization, I'm assuming that they did everything that was proper to deaccession those pieces and bring them up for auction. The only thing I get worried about when you bring something, especially a blue chip artist like Warhol, to an auction, is that that's never going to go back in the public hands. Even if we're oversaturated with Warhol, surely in the American museum collection world, it's very unlikely that another institution could ever afford to purchase a piece like that at auction. It's a rare instance. So that's always a little disheartening, because when you know you're going to dispose of something and your option is to bring it to auction, which is usually the best case scenario for any institution, right? It's very unlikely it's going to go back into the public. And that should always be the first effort. We should always try and put it back in another public institution or keep it in the public realm, because that's where it was. And that should always be the goal. That's a big reason why museums do not deaccession and then like, oh, we're just going to give it back to the donor. It was theirs, it was whatever, because it sets a really poor precedent.
Yeah.
And then you're bringing it back out. Your goal should always be able to keep it out there in the public. Those are just some thoughts.
Yep.
Yeah, no, I agree with that too. In this particular instance, I was not, attached to that particular piece, but generally I'm in agreement.
Yeah, but now we've got Brooklyn Museum who unloaded a couple. Now the Met's talking about it. These are not small institutions, and there are others that are much smaller that are going about it, so it really has set off a real effect. And honestly, the AAM guidelines about it are pretty clear, and all of these resolutions, whether it's AAMD or AAM, they're there for these instances, right? So, I mean, the people who are fervently in favor of or fervently against deaccessioning for the financial benefit as opposed to collection building, make this point over and over again that the ethics involved are specifically to avoid the conflict in these situations, right? And it's like, here we are, the moment, reality hits and, everyone realizes that we're losing, millions of dollars, that, you start wanting to sell things off. But there is another component to the deaccessioning, and you sort of alluded to it before, Paddy. It's the social justice element that's sort of attached to it, whether it's, reducing staff or dealing with staff who want to organize and for labor reasons. And then, of course, there's a tie-in to who our institutions represent, and of course the racial and ethnic disparities have been highlighted over the last year, from George Floyd's death, and then the economic inequality that came with everything. So, I mean, how do you see deaccessioning tying in to let's start first with labor, because we've seen so many people unionizing in museums, especially. I mean, do you see those two factors as being connected? I mean, unionization has been going on prior to the pandemic too, but.
Well, I would argue everything is connected in a sort of larger sense. But I do think that the issue of labor is really connected to deaccessioning because, you know, we live in a country that does not fund the arts properly. I think if we were in a different place where the government spent more money on the institutions designed to preserve culture and protect it, and did not leave that to billionaires who do not have an implicit interest in the public. They have, which is not to say that billionaires are bad people de facto, like they just have, they don't have the same concerns. You know, it is not sexy to pay for arts workers. It is sexy to put your name over a wing, you know, like that. Those are the types of things that a billionaire is going to privilege, at least as we've seen, you know, that tends to be how they spend their money. So when we come up with issues that are directly related to the pandemic, you know, and there are museums that are legitimately suffering, you know, one thing I would have really liked to have seen, although I think it was sort of wishful thinking, was some real leadership amongst some of the wealthier museums, which would have meant, in my opinion, paying for the labor that was lost. You know, like they didn't, like those are the things that I think are coming up, like the labor. I'm glad that there is unionizing efforts. You know, this sort of specifically dovetailed with the new museum last year when they held the Hans Hacke exhibition, which was, you know, heavily invested in a lot of that work critiquing underpaid arts labor and all the rest. And at the same time, the museum is like engaging in union busting, right? Mm-hmm. So we have all of these things sort of playing at the same time. And I think the artists have really traditionally and still do, like the living artists tend to represent more progressive values than the museums that show their work and employ arts workers.
Yeah. No, and we've seen this time and again. I think. And just as a general point, we in order to for today's show, we did aggregate a lot of these articles from the news, and so I'll make those available after the fact. And one of the articles that Paddy contributed was this N+1 article that touched on a lot of the institutions, and I thought it was a really good who had this contradiction between institutional positions on things, union busting, for example, things, values that seem to be held by the upper administration or the board that differed wildly from museum staff or the general museum staff or how the museum wished to be portrayed. And so it's a real contradiction that we see quite a lot of. And I wonder how much of, it was like 5 minutes after, lockdown started, museums started laying off people and furloughing people. And my question was always, are they hurting that badly that they couldn't ride it out for a couple of months? Because none of us knew how long it was going to last, right? But immediately everybody was let go and furloughed. And it just really pointed to the fact that there is a funding problem here. And we're so dependent on private donors. Now, I understand from my European colleagues that, it's much better there, but it's not 100% resolved, and they can't, support everyone forever. So if you're listening and you're from Europe, let us know in the chat how things are going there. And speaking of the chat, Robin, is there anything happening in the chat that we should know about? Any good questions or comments?
So far it's pretty quiet. So
right.
We'll just keep waiting for people to chime in when they're ready.
All right, sounds good. Amanda, any thoughts about this? You're in a state that's not so union friendly.
Yeah, I think back to the conversation I think we had about a year ago.
Yeah.
When we started talking about unionization, and in Florida, there's some unions, there's a lot of education, like educator unions and what have you in Florida, but it's not like in the Northeast.
Yeah.
Where I think you see a more common footprint of it for various industries or various trades. So it doesn't really seem to exist in a full force down here, which is a real shame. But I would also, like the competition for certain jobs down here is very different than it is in the Northeast. Like you probably have a great deal more contract art handlers and preparators and registrars and arguably conservators. We just they're just not the same down here for whatever that's worth. So it's hard to see that forming here, although I could see it absolutely happening somewhere like the Northeast or even in California possibly.
Right.
You just have a bigger amount of that stuff. People, that industry.
Is there a sense that staff are underpaid, underrepresented, not treated properly?
In Florida?
In Florida, yeah. Because obviously, like everyone here is, talking about it, and here for me is New York, because there have been so many places like the Guggenheim most recently that have gone that route, and not registrars, which is an interesting point, but it seems to be art handlers, preparators.
Right. And also I would argue one of the most underappreciated positions in the entire, at least art museum field, is what I can speak to, and that's my opinion. It's hard to say. I haven't worked at every institution in Florida to know how they're valued. I mean, I certainly keep my eye on the salary surveys that come out every year from AAMD. And then when, AAM decides to make those available to people without charging them $100 for it, I get to look at those too. And it doesn't really seem like the salaries are not where I would argue they should be for people who are basically the backbone of an institution.
Right.
So that's my 2 cents. I think you have a lot of people, especially when you look at the art handling world, the preparator world. These are skills that take time to learn. You could argue some of them are trades, and I don't say that disparagingly. I think a lot of the individuals I've worked with are craftsmen, and they have a true talent. Craftswomen, it's everybody, and it's not reflected in how they're paid. It's not reflected in how they're treated. And it's certainly not reflected in other ways. And that's in general in the museum field, I would say too, not just, by institution.
Yeah.
I would just add too, because I'm in Florida as well. Florida's weird for many different reasons, like politically, culturally, everything. We are such a weird combination of, we have elements of the Northeast, we have elements of the Midwest, we have elements of traditional South. So trying to even compare salaries between what you see in North Florida to what you see in like Miami to what you see where Amanda works in St. Pete, it's so weird.
And we also add into the mix that we have a huge immigrant population from not specifically Cuba, but a lot of South America as well. I mean, it's a huge presence in our state. It's an interesting melting pot. I would argue it's also kind of a good thing too at times, but we are a rare bird.
Yeah, not going to argue that. I mean, in a way, a lot of what we're talking about is we're talking about equity in some respect and about justice, and it kind of leads into a conversation about the other aspect of social justice, which is our environment, our context, just in general in life, and post George Floyd's death. And obviously we're talking about this at the time that his killer is on trial. But what is the role? I mean, this is a kind of a bad question, but I'm going to still ask it. Like, what is the role of our institutions and specifically our collections in this new context? Like, how do we? I mean, ARCS, for example, is in the process of trying to create better engagement by the diversity, the diverse populations of the country, as opposed to just sort of white primarily women in the collections care field. So this is being reflected in a lot of places, and museums are trying to diversify. But like, in what other ways should we be addressing this issue? Do you have any thoughts on this, Patty?
Well, I think this is like anything, a work in progress. I mean, we saw last year the Whitney launch or abort an attempt to launch a show in the education department that would have been filled with materials that they had acquired from like a lot of the protests. And the complaint there was that the people who had the works that had been acquired, like they had not gotten permission from the artist before they made the announcement that this was something that was going to take place. So a lot of, I think, you know, one of the problems that museums also struggle with is that the pace of change is very difficult to keep up with. And we see this in a lot of different places right now where we can, you know, museums are, no offense, guys, but you don't move that quickly. But there's like good reason for that, right? Like, institutions are not designed to be these agile, responsive organizations. That's the point, is that they're stable and they don't change because their job is to preserve culture.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, and we see, you know, we look at what happened with, say, the Philip Guston show. I mean, this is obviously a show that was planned for years, and then it came about right at a very contentious time in world history, because we saw that the Black Lives Matter protests not only affected the United States, but they were worldwide. And so that show specifically resonated with a lot of people now, or the presence of that show at that time clearly, you know, struck a nerve. I mean, how do you feel about the fact that was canceled?
Oh, I'm sorry. Could you repeat the which show was canceled?
The Philip Guston
fire track.
Yeah, no worries. Just talking about the Philip Guston show that was postponed for a few years.
Yeah, I mean that's like a little bit of a hornet's nest, right? Like that.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I have a specific stance on that cancellation, just because there's just like so much back and forth in terms of like what the curator, like the back and forth between the curators and like the decision being made. And I don't know, like,
I mean, it's a tough one simply because, I mean, I go back and forth on it myself, but, you know, I was reading that article about it this morning, and I was thinking, wow, you know, the Ku Klux Klan representations in there, that is part of the show, but it's not the entire show. And so that is, you know, and obviously the point's been made, like there was just like a full white curatorial staff working on this. And, you know, I think the real critical point was, you know, we can't make these representations with the current thinking that went behind it, that went into it. It needs to be a more diverse group of people presenting the show. But, you know, the show didn't revolve around those images. That was part of the artist's career. So, I mean, I see it both ways. And, you know, I was, you know, I'm generally a fan of Kaywin Feldman at the National Gallery. And so, you know, I take her opinion, you know, with very seriously. So, and obviously she chose to push it off. So, but, you know, the Tate was angry that they weren't going to get it. So, you know, but the context may be different there. But, you know, Amanda, you look like you wanted to say something. No?
Well, I completely agree with both of you, especially not having been involved in the project. You know, it's hard to understand the nuances of conversation that happened, and one perspective looking at it might seem like, well, these people are damned if they do, damned if they don't. They're coming forward and saying, you know what? We think that we need to broaden our perspective on this show, and we need to bring in other voices, and that we can't, based on the staff we have here or the people involved, we can't present a full picture the way that we should be doing it. And then like the world gets mad at them for that.
Right.
But if they were to go forward, like this is something I personally don't really enjoy, are all of these, which seem to me, which I recognize might be quite silly because I'm a white woman in the world, and these messages are not meant for me. But all of the like organizations coming out and saying, oh, we're so sorry about this, we're so, like, every instance that has happened over the last year, these, like, they feel like empty messages. And it's fine to say that, of course it should go without question that all of these things that have happened in our country and throughout the world in the past year are terrible. But what are you doing about it? You can't just stand there and say it's bad and then like put no action behind those words, which I think is how it feels. And I think that, to me, that kind of sounds like what you were saying, Patty. Like, we're just so slow to react sometimes in the museum field that even though we can put out these words and say these things, like, but what are we doing to try and change it? And it's so slow going, and we're not seeing the action that we want to, that it sounds like we're saying we want to see. And so coming out and saying they wanted to pause the show because they felt like more context was needed or more voices would need to be brought in. It's like, well, okay, so here's someone who finally recognized that maybe what they were saying might be disingenuous in some way, and they wanted to be better about it, and then we're still mad at them. So that's how, like, that's that back and forth I have in my mind about that, and that's kind of what it spears from.
Yeah, no, I think that there was a lot of that for me as well. I think just in terms of sort of negotiating like what people say and what they want to do, and also like a certain history with museums where like this might be my own stuff, but I always feel like museums are assembling like diversity committees and committees designed to like get to the bottom of a problem. And like a lot of times these things take many years, and the internal politics of the museum prevent any of the recommendations from being implemented. So what ends up happening is a little bit of like bucket kicking, so you're just kicking things down the road rather than really being able to address them. And there's a part of this that I think is like, I don't really blame the museum. I don't want to blame the museums entirely for this, for what I think is like often a very good faith effort to try and address things. But that, I guess I just seen it at a lot of different museums where there is no change in the end. And I think, one of the weird things actually was that like the Guggenheim had that big shakeup, and like Nancy Spector left, and there was a big investigation there that basically found that she was not responsible for anything, but she got pushed out anyway. And there was a lot, I'm sure there was a ton behind the scenes on that.
Yeah.
And, some of these stories, we just won't know the full story.
Right. Exactly. Well, when it comes to representation, we do recognize that, what we put out in the world, it does matter. And, for a lot of white people, we don't think as, it doesn't affect us as much. And so whether it's, say Philip Guston representing the Ku Klux Klan, or if it's a Confederate monument. I mean, I went to school in Texas, and there were, monuments on campus that were of, people that were slaveholders, but they were, instrumental in founding the institution and such. And, it was contentious even then, but I walked by them and I didn't think about it. but for many others, it had a significant role. And you know, maybe one of the things that we should talk about is like, you know, what it matters if the institution is private, public, if it's a government institution as well, because you know the government's essentially aligning itself with the image that it's putting out. So, you know, I don't know. I mean, where do you fall on? I mean, is there another way to look at the Confederate monument situation? I mean, are we just going to start destroying that stuff, or what do we keep? I mean, and honestly, if anyone's out there that's listening that has any input on this and is dealing with it, we want to hear from you, because I'm sure that there are institutions dealing with this sort of thing.
I mean, I would be happy to get rid of a lot of that stuff, quite honestly, but
yeah,
that,
I mean, can we talk about it in the same way that we talk about, say, the Philip Guston show? Is sort of where I'm coming from, like, because for me, it's an idea of representation.
You know what? This is a corollary thing. So, but I'm just going to bring it up because I think it's important when we talk about race and all the rest. So, Dred Scott, like last year, did the slave rebellion reenactment. I don't know if you all followed that, but that was in New Orleans, and it was kind of amazing. This was the largest slave uprising in American history. And like all that existed prior to his piece was like a little plaque on this like island. I think there was some like a Costco or some, you know, box like franchise like next to it. And there was this tiny thing. And when you think about that relative to say the like all of the plantations that are like mini museums now that sort of preserve that history, and like what was important for the people, like this slave rebellion that only gets this plaque, like you can kind of see like there's a difference in the way that we treat some monuments and other monuments, and like what becomes a monument and what doesn't. And I think like that, like every time we talk about preserving a statue, what doesn't happen is we don't talk about what doesn't get preserved, what we haven't deemed is important. And I think that unfortunately, like, may be a little bit beyond what a registrar can do. But like, I do think that needs to be part of the conversation, right? Like, because we all are used to dealing with the things that are like the actual objects that have already come to us, but it's what's missing that is the cost. And those costs are invisible, and we, like, as arts workers, we have to find ways to make them visible.
Yeah. And I mean, I think many of us feel that there's a disparity between, you know, what we're feeling, you know, as we work with the collections, and we feel like what we're seeing on a daily basis, and then what gets put out by the museum is often somehow a little bit different. And so, you know, you end up with, you know, these sort of disparaging situations, but, you know, which is, you know, that people, you know, on the board that, you know, it's sort of we're talking about the whitewashing of, you know, back to money again, you know, we're whitewashing people's reputations by putting their name on the wing, but we need the museums need the money. And, you know, we saw that, you know, just what happened with Leon Black at MoMA, which is a big deal. You know, he stepped down as the president of their board, and you know, and he's a major collector too. So, I mean, it's gonna keep going on. So, I wanted to, any good comments from the chat, Robin? I just want to check in there before we, you know, shift gears.
No, besides people agreeing with me that Florida's weird. That's it. So okay. We have a consensus beyond that.
Well, I mean, say no more. So, all right. Where do you want, which way do you want to go? Binning bronzes or NFTs? I kind of want to go NFTs. Do you want to do that? You have a preference, Patty?
Oh, NFTs.
Yeah. I think this is an interesting subject because I think that NFTs and blockchain stuff in general solves a major problem in our work, especially in the registrar side of the industry, right? The documentation is critical, and if we can verify and solidify that it is amazing. Now, the NFT thing that came out recently is, of course, it's a way to document and create scarcity for a digital object, right? And can you give a better definition than I just did?
Well, sure. So, I mean, I can try. So I like to start with blockchain technology and Bitcoin because I think there's a little bit more, we might know what that is, at least a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So Bitcoin is a currency. And like any currency, if you give a dollar, it doesn't matter what dollar, it's a dollar, and they're completely exchangeable. Now, Bitcoin exists on the blockchain. The blockchain, I understand it a little bit like anybody who uses QuickBooks.
Yeah.
They might reconcile their accounts. The blockchain does this for each transaction. So every time a transaction happens, there is a permanent record that it's been reconciled. So once it's been reconciled, it's written in stone. You can't change it. That is the way that it exists. This was exciting to people. I mean, I guess it's still exciting to people, but Nick Land, a sort of crazy right-wing person, but who also wrote a fairly important series of writing on Bitcoin in an art text that I can't remember the name of now, several years ago, 2013. He coined the term distributed trust. Basically, the idea is, we're all in different places, and while the feds sort of ensure that the bonds are we trust that in the feds that they will back the bonds and that they're not going to fail. We also have this idea of distributed trust. We trust in the blockchain and that the ledger and this process is unbreakable, which leads us to NFTs. So what does this have to do with NFTs? Well, NFT stands for non-fungible token, which means that unlike regular currency, each one of these tokens is completely unique and it exists on the blockchain. So it's using, mostly they tend to use Ethereum. But that means that all of the transactions are tracked, but it is this it is a unique document. Essentially, it's a receipt. Nobody likes to call it that because it's profoundly unsexy, and you would never get $69 million for a suite of images, but that's what somebody purchased. And you, in your digital wallet, you would also have the collection of JPEGs.
Yeah, exactly. And so essentially, I think I neglected to say at the beginning that you also host a podcast called Explain Me. And I listened to your episode about NFTs, which was really good. And I think it was there that someone made the point that it's okay, well, everyone has seen an image of the Mona Lisa. It's proliferated all around the internet, but you don't own the Mona Lisa, right? So the person who owns the NFT is analogous to, owning the Mona Lisa, right? So, and, distributing the image around the internet, if you have the NFT, only goes to raise the value of the piece. So so I think it's going to be a big deal because, you know, now it's on the map, right? Now people are collecting them. So that just means that collectors and museums will start to acquire these things more readily. People will be, I mean, Sotheby's and Christie's take Bitcoin now. You can pay in Bitcoin. PayPal, you can pay with Bitcoin. Blockchain is going to be around now. It's here. So I think we all need to become familiar with it. What's your thought on it, Amanda?
Well, I mean, I agree with you that blockchain technology is going to be pretty excellent for the work we do, at least as registrars and individuals who manage documentation and all those things that, you know, essentially your paper files or your digital files are as important as the object itself. So that's only going to help secure that. I still struggle understanding Bitcoin and NFTs or nifties, as John doesn't like to call them. Still struggling a little bit to figure all that out, because a lot of times, especially with technology, I find a lot of it's like in this area cloud above my head, and I don't get like the nuance of it. And you know, a lot of us are still so used to that tangible, like this is a piece of paper and this is what it does. That's sometimes hard to make the leap. So that's where I stand with those. Yeah. But the one thing that I did not expect was the amount of carbon footprint that NFTs have. And I had no idea, because I would, you know, most in my mind, oh, you put something digital, it's like it's a great thing. It's good for the environment. Like you're getting literal physical things off, you're stop killing trees, excellent. But no, apparently not. The energy used to process and to do the exact thing, like you were saying, Patty, to make like all of these very unique points happen on the blockchain, like that's an energy suck. And I had no clue. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, to Patty's point, you know, the idea that it's decentralized, it's distributed, means that essentially a copy of whatever of that transaction log exists on nodes or, you know, computers distributed around the world. So the reason you can't hack it, because it's not in one place. You have to hack hundreds or thousands or possibly millions of the same thing, right? And so in order to process those transactions all of those nodes, it uses a ton of energy. And one of the articles that I'm gonna, you know, post to accompany this talk is written by an artist that does digital work, and who's very much anti-NFT, and for this very reason, just because you literally cannot reconcile it. There's no amount of carbon offsets that you can buy, even if you believe a carbon offset actually works. There's no amount that you can buy that will offset the amount of energy that it uses in order to make it work. So it's a difficult one to reconcile. Yeah.
Well, and the other thing too, I worry about that is, you know, not only are we trying to move, you know, arguably the entire world's trying to be a little bit more environmentally friendly because we'd like to be around a little bit longer.
Yeah.
And a lot of practices in the past have really kind of ruined that for us. But also because of all the energy I start to worry that like this cycle where it's like free the man, give the man access to everything. Just kidding, it costs a lot of money and we're going to bring it back to the really wealthy people that only they can do it. It's like that's what I'm worried about. Like this democratization or whatever the word is of this practice may actually all of a sudden come back into the hands of the few.
I think anytime you hear the word democratization in tech, you should like run away. It tends to be like
is it an oxymoron? I don't know.
Well, it's like web tech company propaganda almost, you know, not to like overstate the issue, but like that is something that you see a lot. I see a lot in tech press releases and things that no human should have to read, that are like just puffed up claims. But I think like this would be one area where I do, I don't know what the solution is to the carbon footprint that this makes, because it's enormous, and I don't know how you reduce it. I do think that this would be one area where I feel like it would be very useful for not just the leaders of industry to kind of own everything that this stuff works upon. So what I'm talking about here are the platforms that manage the technology, which tends to be, if you want to deal with it yourself, like very cumbersome. So that is why there's you can, if you're an artist, you can sell your stuff on Super Rare. There's it's a website that hosts things, hosts digital art, NFTs. There's also a website called Nifty, confusingly enough, but it's spelled NIFTY.
And Nifty Gateway as well. And there's a few.
Yeah. So all of these things, they have their own contracts, and a lot of times I think what ends up happening is artists just use the default, and this was sort of interesting because Kevin McCoy, who with Anil Dash, so Kevin McCoy is an artist, Anil Dash was the technologist at the Rhizome 7-on-7 conference in 2013, I think. They came up with a concept called Monograph, which was basically bringing together Bitcoin and artists and to create the world's first NFT platform, right? So it didn't last very long. Rhizome actually completed the project for the duo who conceived this. But one of the problems that Kevin said that he had, and he told us this in an Explain Me podcast on Bitcoin a couple years ago, was that artists only use the default for the pricing. And and this is something that I noticed in some of the materials that we're seeing now, that people use the default contracts that these companies use, and they don't alter them at all, right? And this is where people get into trouble, but it's also where there's a lot of opportunity, right? So if we have people in the arts who are working to ensure artist resale rights, who are working to build smart contracts that might also pay gallery staff, staff members, or Sarah Ludi, who's an artist who worked, showed at Bitform, did a contract like that with one of her NFTs. These are ways that we can start to try and balance the scales a little bit, but we have to be in control. And I think the problem is that, as arts workers, we don't have unlimited time, and this I think is the biggest hurdle towards, achieving a more equitable workplace, more equitable systems, is that we don't have unlimited time to spend on these things. And that is what we really need to build and promote them.
This is so good. I want to make sure that we're almost at the hour mark here, and I want to go to the chat one more time to see if there's any questions or comments in there. Robin, what do you have for me?
There is. It says, is there a museum that is collecting or likely to collect NFTs? And is there a museum starting to implement blockchain for registrars?
This is something I do not know very much about. John, do you know?
I mean, look, I don't know about museums collecting, but I mean, obviously there are galleries selling the stuff. I mean, in terms of the blockchain for registrars, what I do know about is there are several companies out there that are using blockchain to verify and what's the word? Create, and document it on using blockchain technology, title and provenance. So in 2018, Christie's did a sale with a company called Artery, and they sold like $300 million worth of stuff. And what it was that Artery, it was from a private collection, and Artery did the research to verify the provenance history and as well as the title of each work. And so once you register that on the blockchain, as we discussed before, that is immutable, right? You can't change it. So what that does is that there's an inherent value to the work, because that, I don't know what the artist was, say it's a Picasso, right? Well, that's a Picasso, and that provenance is solid, right? So that gives it a more stable value. Now, and I know that there are companies like Codex Protocol and Verisart that are doing that for artists that are contemporary. So imagine, you buy that piece fresh from the gallery, and the gallery or the artist himself has documented it with one of these companies, and so it's on the blockchain. So you start at the beginning of the piece's history, and you document it on the blockchain. I mean, I like to think of like the Salvator Mundi Da Vinci work. If we knew the provenance of that work, I mean, that'd be $1 billion work, right? I mean, as it was a contentious history and provenance and dubious attribution, it still sold for $450 million. So if we had blockchain for that, just saying. So that's what I know about blockchain for registrars, but it's not complete. And I do also know that they're using it for commercial shipping, and which means that it'll probably trickle down to art shipping as well in the form of smart contracts. So I'll let you guys look that one up. And if anybody really wants it, I can send you links. But I think that's a really interesting thing, because what a smart contract does is like you just trigger the button and it just executes a contract. So when you're doing international shipping, when it's going from one port to the next, to the next, to the next, you don't have to refile paperwork. It's just automatically transacting, and you can document all of that. So you know exactly where that piece has been because you have a register of it. So I know that much. That's about where my knowledge ends. So, but yeah, I mean, look, if Christie's is selling NFTs, a museum is gonna be coming soon, right?
It's just a matter of time before someone
Exactly.
donates their NFT to an institution.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that's usually how museums get it. It would be very rare for the museum to purchase something like that, especially given its current market value.
Right. Exactly. Well, I mean, I think most people are sort of put off by the idea of what those NFT images are actually representing. I mean, there's a interesting article about the Beeple one that the 5,000 days that sold for $69 million. I mean, there's a lot of not so savory images in there. So maybe that has to change before museums start to collect it. But
they might get lent one before they actually have one they have to deal with in their collection.
Yeah, exactly. But there's major artists that are using this. Ai Weiwei, is like, the biggest artist of the time. And, he's been dealing with blockchain stuff. So, NFTs aren't new. They're just new to the mainstream. So, with that, unless there's any other questions or comments, I think we should start to wrap things up. Any last thoughts? I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there that we could be talking about right now. So, anything last in the chat, Robin?
Nope, it's been pretty quiet today.
Okay, no worries.
Thank you for the few comments that did come through, though, everyone.
Appreciate it. I guess I should say more racy things next time. So, with that, Paddy, tell us what you're up to, and tell us how people can find out about what you're doing and what you're writing.
Right, so I have a review of the Cause show at the Brooklyn Museum coming out in the art newspaper any day now. It's probably, for anybody who receives the print version, it's already printed, but it goes online sometime this week. So keep an eye out for that. For anybody who works closely with artists, VVrkshop, the company I run, offers high-level professional training to artists in the field of communication, specifically digital communication, and pricing, and pretty much all ends of that. And of course, I do run the Explain Me podcast with the artist William Pohida, and we run that podcast maybe once every month and a half, 2 months. So we're due for a new one.
Gotcha. And any website that people should look out for? Is there a personal one or the VVrkshop website?
VVrkshop.art. So just so everybody knows how that's spelled, it's a little tricky. It's VV. So the V's form a W, VVrkshop.art. And the Explain Me podcast can be found on anywhere you get your podcasts. And everything else can be found on my personal website, which is paddyjohnson.com.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your time today and your insightful comments on all things that are going on in the world. I mean, this is certainly an interesting time, and I think it's going to be precedent setting. So, it's interesting to take stock where we are and see how wrong we are when things actually shake out. So, with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. Again, thank you, Paddy, for joining us. Remember to hit that subscribe button on the YouTube channel so that you can and get those notifications so that you can get notified anytime we have a new video or a new live stream going up. As usual, the podcast version of this will go out this coming Friday after. And in May, we have something extra special lined up. We're just working out the details, so I'm not going to announce it yet, but it's going to be May Day oriented and hopefully interactive, as they say. And so you don't want to miss that. And so that's the first Tuesday in May. Do you know right off what day that is?
May the 4th.
May the 4th. Okay.
4th be with you at 1 p.m. Eastern. Yeah, we will. There will be.
Is that a thing? May the 4th be with you?
Yeah.
4th. Come on, man.
Where have I been? Do we have to come in costume?
You can. If you want
You don't have to, but it's highly encouraged.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a cosplay oriented May Day, FYI. Anyway, so all right, so stay tuned for that. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter and the LinkedIn, and we look forward to seeing you in May. Thank you so much.
Thanks again, everyone.